Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Praxis Plus 10 seminar. I'm Professor Denise Morado from the School of Architecture of the Federal University of Minas Gerais and the coordinator of the Praxis group. I will be with you over the next few days, also with Professor Daniel Medeiros. Before we start our work today, I'd like to inform you that the certificates for the first 3 days of the seminar are already available in the system, and people here who are in the support staff are going to put the link of for the certificates to be requested. It's an immense pleasure to welcome you to the session and to introduce today's guests to our fourth day of the seminar. And I especially appreciate the presence of mediators Gisella, Lobato, and Izabel Diaz. Gisella Lobato is an architect and urban planner at the Catholic University of Minas with a postgraduate degree in project management and architecture and construction from the same university. And she was responsible for the coordination and drafting of the new master plan of the municipality of Belo Horizonte. She was a information manager and monitoring manager and the management of urban policy in the municipal deputy secretary of urban planning of the municipality of Belo Horizonte. Currently, she is the director of urban policy management in the urban planning subsecretariat at the Belo Horizonte municipality government. Izabel Diaz is an architect and urban planner, specialist in sanitary engineering and environment, master in geography. Currently, she's a special advisor to the Municipal Secretariat of Urban Policies of the municipality of Belo Horizonte, and she was an undersecretary of urban planning at Belo Horizonte and an architect at the local government of Belo Horizonte. I'd like to thank her immensely for participating in this conversation with us. Today, the session will be about looking at the city with the following guests and sessions that will be presented in this order. Lydia Collins will present planning for continual negotiation, exploring urban development patterns in Belo Horizonte, Brazil. She is an American urban planner, a master in urban planning at Tufts University, at the Urban and Environmental Planning and Policy School in Boston. She is a specialist in equitable community development. She's also a researcher at Praxis as a Fulbright program scholar. After that, we have Pedro Cícero Ferreira, who is going to be presenting the production of the city in the molds of Airbnb, debating contemporary urbanization based on platform studies. Pedro is a geographer at the Federal University of Minas, master in architecture and urban studies in the same university, and a researcher at Praxis. Renata Salles Soares will be presenting Ethnography Between Borders, Dialogues Between Anthropology and Architecture. She's an architect in urban planning, master in architecture and urbanism at the Architecture and Urbanism program at UFMG, and a researcher at the Praxis. And finally, we have Tarcísio Gostillo Cunha, who's going to be presenting building a method for the identification of fissures in the public spaces. Tarcísio is an architect in urban planning at the Catholic University of Minas and a specialist in urban environment planning at the same institution. He's a master and he also a PhD student in architecture and urbanism at the graduate program for architecture and urbanism at the UFMG, and a professor at Una University and a researcher at Praxis. The speakers will have up to 20 minutes to present their work. And after that, Gisella and Izabel will add their comments and make their questions to each speaker. After that, the speakers will answer questions sent in through YouTube chat from all our participants. So I ask you to send your questions from YouTube. I'd like to thank you all once again for your presence, especially Giselle and Izabel, and to open the floor to the both of them to present themselves and call on the guest speakers. Thank you, Denise. I thank you for the opportunity to be here for such an important exchange between the public sector and universities and academia and different social movements. I saw that we had some very interesting participation in other days. As Denise mentioned, I am an urban planner and architect. I've been working at City Hall for a while. Right now, I'm in the urban planning. I'm the urban planning director at City Hall, and it will be a pleasure for me to be here with you all today. My name is Izabel. I'm partnering up with Gisella. We've also worked together at City Hall. We have this huge challenge, which is the public power, public sector. It's a hard to move machine. And for us, it's very important and gratifying to be able to think together with you, those of you who are in the university and academia, to look at the fissures in the hull of this huge transatlantic ship that is the public sector and the government. It's important for us to bring this to the state. These great discussions from the Praxis group, it's important for us to bring this to the state. It's always challenging. I have a history in academia and outside academia, and now 17 years in City Hall. I thought that I was going to be there a few years, but I've been entangled in this process, which is at the same time challenging and also makes you fall in love with it. So it's important for us to have a moment to stop and think about our work, to look at other ways of thinking about the city, of looking at the city. So I wanted to thank Denise hugely and everyone from the Praxis research group as well for your provocations, all the disagreements we've had and debates that we've been in through the years. And I hope that this is a moment for us to take back this process of the moment, to take back debates, because of the pandemic, we haven't had as much of this, and we need to make these discussions get closer. I know that we're in different places, but in the same struggle and the same sort of perspective. And when I'm saying us, I'm talking about me, Izabel, as the architect, as a person, not as is me in the City Hall, even though we are in different places with oftentimes very different challenges, but I feel very comfortable with the perspective that is proposed by the Praxis group. So we are going to start, as Denise mentioned, with the seminars. Now I'm going to call on Lydia Collins to present her work, which will give us a panorama and a historical perspective before we look at the other speeches. The floor is yours.
Hello, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Lydia Collins. I'm an urban planner from Chicago who's been living in Belo Horizonte, researching with the Fulbright. Before I start, I'd like to thank Praxis for the support with this project. And also I'd like to say that I'm someone who visualizes a lot with drawing. So I'm going to bring a lot of drawings and images instead of words. So I'm going to share my presentation. And I'd like to ask you if you can see. Do you see my notes or just the screen? So I'm going to share just the screen. Okay. I'm going to start my timer. So today I'm going to talk about my context as an urban designer, urban planner in Chicago, and why I'm interested in this parallel between Belo Horizonte and Chicago, and going to explore some of the shared history between Chicago and Belo Horizonte. And then I'm going to talk about my research here in Belo Horizonte and my discoveries. I arrived in February, and so I'm in the midst of my research. I feel that there's, I still don't have a conclusion. So you're seeing my work in process. I'm from Chicago in the US. Chicago has a lot of history and culture, but today I'm going to focus on the issue of segregation because it's a problem that every day in Chicago we have to face that issue. As other places, the root of segregation is in history. We see this map where we can see places where the whites invested and where they didn't. And this is obviously related to race and racism. You can see that we live this legacy in Chicago. The investment in white neighborhoods is much bigger than those with Latino and Black communities. I'm not going to focus on this because, you know, there's a lot on that. So I'm going to try to imagine other worlds, other scenarios where we can think about development that really invests in communities. I used to work in a small team and built housing with communities. There was housing for people who were disabled, low income. We also worked with architects for better design. It was never perfect, but we were always trying to improve the design of the buildings. Here we're working with a committee that we set up so we could set up the projects. There's a really important picture for us showing that in the meetings, the informational meetings, we also took art, and this artwork was a request from the community that we would occupy empty lots with art. So we were always working with the community to transmit the power of the urbanists and architects to the community, to start opening up these structures that we're used to. We also built schools. These are pictures of meetings with students and teachers to discuss the project. Now the winter is coming to an end, but you can see the school when I was leaving in February. It was being built, so it's super exciting for me to see these pictures. See here, I have two project leaders with me, very strong women who led this project. And the project I want to focus on is a commercial project. Here in a neighborhood that had a lot of defunding, there was they asked for a commercial building for small businesses, restaurants. So it's very hard for us to build something like this because the defunding there is very pronounced, and we had to use a lot of funds from philanthropy. So I decided to, with this, how can we build commercial areas which are important to communities? Why is it so difficult in Chicago? I wanted to use this experience and apply my experience in Chicago to a different but similar environment. So I started to learn about Belo Horizonte, and I learned that Belo Horizonte was, you know, the elites in Belo Horizonte in 1893 started to plan this new capital for Minas Gerais. They said they wanted to be the Chicago of Brazil. So I started to learn So I decided to have a look at what this relation could teach me, how to live in a context that's rigid, and how to live in the legacy of this of these initial plans. So I'm going to talk a little about the history. This is when I started to learn about Belo Horizonte and Chicago. I discovered that the famous urban plan of Chicago is after Belo Horizonte. So I threw away that idea. So the directionality changed. So I saw that Belo Horizonte was planned by an idea that Chicago built in 1893 with the World Exposition that showed that Chicago was the image of progress. It was kind of the future of the US, electricity and the railroad. Everybody started to look at Chicago as an image of progress. And Belo Horizonte also pursued that image. And I learned that Chicago was influenced by Barcelona, Paris, Washington, D.C., and Versailles. And I didn't want to look back a lot. So I also saw that Belo Horizonte influenced other cities in Brazil, and Chicago influenced Cleveland, San Francisco, and internationally, Manila and the Philippines. And I saw that there are these connections that cross the world, that there's an initial plan that migrates through different contexts. So I thought this was really interesting. So what is this plan? What is this? What makes up this plan? In my mind, I see the world like this. The plans are created by values, and the values, they are mixed up, and the story, then they become stories, and stories become culture, and that's what creates these different plans. So I looked at Versailles also. So I started to think about this culture of colonialism. I don't want to focus on this, but I want to show that the culture of the place becomes the form of the place. So you see the form, and the culture that accompanies the form was sent throughout the world. So through Chicago and Belo Horizonte. And when I arrived in Belo Horizonte, I wanted to have a critical view of the culture that was sent from Chicago to Belo Horizonte. So in Chicago, the World Planning Exhibition was, on the one hand, was progress. Oh, wow, we're amazing. We're an advanced city. But in actuality, the people who built the city themselves did not were not a part of this project that they were creating. And this whole idea was also sent to Belo Horizonte. So created by people who didn't live around the area. So I think it's important that we learn about the culture that plans the cities. So a closed culture creates a closed format, and a closed city results. I'm going to talk about my theoretical basis. I'm always trying to understand how things function here, and praxis works in the intersection of these four ideas. So the purple area brings together my research, which brings together humanist geography, urban theory, and architecture. And we are living in the legacies of closed cities. They're rigid, they don't have space for conflicts, they're unsustainable. And a city that's sustainable is a city that's open. No, it's not just about being very green, there's not a lot of carbon, but it's also about how the society works, that the city is open, diverse, adaptable, sustainable. And I use the humanist geography to think about the sense of a place by Kante, because he talked about you have to think about the form, the activities, and the sense, and also the idea of reading of the location that I've been working with Praxis, the language games, and decryption. How can we use the language to open the power, open up fissures in power, and question the city we have today? This idea is in construction. So my central question with bringing together my experience in Chicago and the whole history of Belo Horizonte, and interpretation apologizes. There was a pause. How can we build a better city? I don't know if my internet is okay. How can we encourage fluidity so that we can move from closed cities to open cities? So I started to trail to create a criteria that could try to establish criteria for open life. So Richard Sennett has 5 criteria, and I added my own. There's inside, not just open air, diverse people, not just racially, but in terms of age. It has to be a place where I go. I don't want to go into a community that is not mine. Public and private spaces within the hypercenter that has commercial areas that reuses a place. We have all that we need, so we have to think about abandoned spaces, and that has cultural activity. That's really important for me, because I think culture directs everything. As an urban planner, we should follow culture. And then I apply this to the methods of reading a city. This is another application. I'm not going to go into this. So I started to get to know spaces that started to develop a few elements of these criteria. So I'm going to show some examples, but I'm in the beginning stages. I've carried out some design, some drawings, and some interviews. The Mercado Novo, it's a market. It's a multi-use area. I'd never seen a market like this in Chicago, in my country, and in the US. These are pictures of people that invited me there. And I started to organize the ideas. What are the criteria that are strong there? And then I went to Sula. It's a neighborhood that's really interesting. Maybe you know about it. So I started to draw it, try to understand it. So I started to get to know Edifício Maleta, the salespeople and cultural groups there, and then the Galeria Ouvidor, I started to get to know a very, very dense area. So I'm going to end here and let the next speakers go ahead and speak.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Your work was very interesting. I think it brings us a very poetic point of view to the city, this thing that they have with the images and this concept that's very strong about culture and how this is transposed to the form of the cities. I think that this idea of this network and web between Chicago and Belo Horizonte, how things trespass different areas and structural things of capitalist society. I'm not going to start the debate right now, but I just basically thanking you. In a little bit, I will have some questions. And now I'm going to call Pedro Henrique for his presentation. After all of the presentations, we'll open up for the debate. Pedro, you have the floor. First and foremost, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. My name is Pedro Cícero, and I'm going to be presenting a presentation that's actually partial results of my master's dissertation that I developed at Praxis with the orientation of Professor Lobato. The research is about Airbnb and how it has been bringing new urbanization process to the complex geography of Brazilian cities. My presentation is structured like an article. So we have 6 different parts, 6 sections. First, I'm going to present the platform studies as a theoretical framework to understand Airbnb, the sharing economy and urban micro entrepreneurship, and also how platform capitalisms and platform urbanism have been inserted into the social world and how this actually impacts the spaces based on the real estate. So we'll be looking at some recently launched real estate to look at that. As a digital platform, Airbnb has eliminated intermediaries in the old rental process, and it facilitates this rental process and access to housing. So the platform has the guests, the people who need some kind of real estate or a place to be, and hosts. They're not necessarily the owners, but they're the people who are administrating a given property for Airbnb. In this sense, we can say that Airbnb is a digital infrastructure for hosting that is only actually works when local people put their property for rental. So even though it's digital, it is associated to housing. When it was founded in 2008, in the middle of the 2008 real estate crisis in the United States, they were looking at a collaborative practice, trying to help people to increase their income in relation to, also as a response to the loss of purchasing power in the United States. What Airbnb has been demonstrating, however, especially in associating itself to large investment groups, Airbnb has revealed itself as a predominantly a company that's dominated by commercial practices, since its agents are the ones that are responsible for the largest part of the income that's generated when that's dominated by real estate agents. So we can say that the professional use has been transforming Airbnb into an international international hosting corporation and changing its characteristics, and it incentivizes certain characteristics that are influence the way cities are built by influencing the real estate market, especially with renting in the short term, shared spaces, and things that are managed by digital platforms. So here I have a little bit about the relationship between platform capitalism and platform urbanism. We can see that there's a dialectical relationship between them because one gives form to the other. Platform capitalism has to do with a series of transformation in the capitalist mode of production, which have been happening since the 1970s. I like to highlight among them flexibilization of labor, financialization of the economy, and the application of digital technologies in productive processes. In this way, platform companies emerge as companies which are structured by a business model which are based on extracting and controlling large databases. So Airbnb specifically is an agent for digitalization of the ways in which hosting is produced and the ways in which housing is managed, that is, the services that become monetized through online interaction. Platform urbanism has to do with the reorganization of the city and its materiality to privilege the processes that are run by platforms. That is, the digital platforms with an positive power in the organization of cities in order to produce their economic practices. So we can say that in platform urbanism, cities become permeated by a platform ecosystem. And what is that? It's a set of companies that dominate the industrial digital industry. So we can say that in Belo Horizonte, Airbnb, Loque, and other companies act in mobility. We have 99 Pop and Uber. So we have a variety of different digital platforms that are acting at the same time in the urban space, and they are going to be voicing their demands. So sharing economy is an economic model, one of the modes of production that are part of the platform capitalism. In this kind of economic model, we can say that the relation of consumption is based on temporary access to goods, unlike traditional property. So in Airbnb, you need to rent a housing for a short amount of time. You don't buy houses on Airbnb. So in this way, sharing economy widens consumptions by reintroducing idle goods into the market. And so there are a lot of people in Airbnb who have a second property and they put them on Airbnb. And there's also investments that invest in real estate and use Airbnb as one more channel of distribution of their goods, in this case, the rental of the properties. So it's the reintroduction of idle goods back into the economy mediated by the digital technology. In this sense, local agents are called on to rent their properties. So they want to put them in the platform to continue their income generation. So we can see that in the case of Airbnb, we have a transformation of housing into a company to create profit and also as a product to be consumed, so that for hosts, the property is a company, and for the guests, the property is a product. So we can say that Airbnb users as hosts, they become sub-renters because of these processes of sublocation that happen. The expressiveness of this digital economy articulated by Airbnb ended up transforming the portfolio of real estate companies. You can see that Airbnb has different fronts of value generation For Airbnb, there's not all places in the city that are attractive to Airbnb. It's usually more for places that have already undergone improvement of their urban infrastructure, and real estate agents are mold their practices in the sense of trying to capture this opportunity of potential income through real estates, because Airbnb potentializes the income of a real estate. So if you have a long-term rental for people living there, you have a price of X. And when you put this piece of property on Airbnb, this price of X goes up. You get more potential profit. So you will raise your potential profit with a given piece of real estate. So I have a few examples so you can see how this has been going on in the Brazilian reality. Some cities are living this more intensely than others, but I was able to bring a few different examples here. The first of them would be the building called All You Need in the city of Curitiba, which is a partnership between TAN and GT Invest. Most of the times, these properties that I'm presenting are partnerships between construction companies and investment companies. So there's a strong relationship with financial capital. In this context of All You Need, we have studios from 17 to 44 square meters with multifunctional furniture, bike sharing, gyms, public kitchen and laundry, and etc. The management of the property is done online through digital platforms with functions for asking for a reservation of common areas, access to different condominium services, mail alerts, pay-per-use services such as cleaning, maintenance, laundry. So the All You Need building was built exclusively for use of Airbnb. So you have short-term rentals in the regulation. This is extremely important because one of the main blocks for the participation of a given piece of real estate in Airbnb is the different condominium regulations, because oftentimes they ban this type of rental to mitigate any impacts for long-term residents. So the All You Need strategy was exactly to put short-term rental into its regulation to guarantee that even after some real estate has been sold, the properties have been sold, the owners can also rent them in Airbnb. Another example is the Trajano house from the constructor company Stabilité in the historic center of Curitiba. This building was also built in order to be used as an income generation platforms, especially in Airbnb, but also in Short Stay Curitiba, which is another very similar digital platform, but it's local to the city. This building has 65 apartments ranging in size from 23 to 49 square meters, and common areas such as a co-working area, laundry, a gym, and etc. Another example is the Elysia Building that was built by the incorporated Burkhardt and Cronin Engineering and Concepta Design. The building has 300 apartments that go from 16 square meters to 44 square meters. And it has common spaces such as a gym, co-working area, a drugstore, supermarket, and others. Not all of the apartments in this property are planned for being digitally rented. Out of the 360 are going to be owned by the incorporator, and they're the ones that are going to place this into Booking and Airbnb. Another important example is the Vitacom construction company. I didn't bring a specific example, but it's important to talk about this company because it's one of the main construction companies building in this model in the city of São Paulo. Their enterprises, we can see that this flyer says building prepared for Airbnb. Their real estate that's built to be rented at Airbnb, and their intermediary is done by Housey, which is the largest Airbnb host in the city of São Paulo. So we have a construction company that's building buildings only to rent them in Airbnb, rent them apartment by apartment. Finally, I have another example here, a partnership that Airbnb had with a large Miami incorporator in the construction of a building called Nativo. Just like the previous case in Sao Paulo that are managed by Housey, Nativo is not for permanent housing, but for the creation of income through short-term rentals managed by Airbnb. In this case, Airbnb is financing a project that is a model for other enterprises and other constructions. This is sort of like an apartment hotel, but through this sharing modality, so it doesn't fall under the same kinds of regulations as traditional hoteling. So I'd like to finish up. Well, my study was an attempt to map some of the movements in the real estate market in the sense of capturing income that was created for by Airbnb and enterprises based on Airbnb. And so we have short-term management, the intensive use of digital technology, sharing infrastructure, and so on and so forth. But the massification of these trends depend on a variety of different factors, such as political and economic and cultural aspects, but especially the future of the digital platforms. What we can see is that these platforms, even though they are recent, more and more they shape our city and our urban way of life more and more. So the future of these digital platforms, I believe, will be the future of will affect the future of the cities that we live in. So I think this discussion is very important in this sense. Here I have my main references that I used, and that's it. Here I have my email in case anyone wants to get in touch to continue the discussion. Please feel free to email me. I thought I went a little bit quickly, but that's a little bit of what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Pedro. Wow, your discussion about this this other logic of the non-property, but the use of spaces, it brings a lot of provocations for us. I know you stratify for very specific social strata, but it brings a lot of provocations for a discussion that we'll have shortly following. And I'd like to thank you for your talk and invite Renata to take the floor. It's over to you, Renata. Hello, I'm going to share my screen. Are we good? Can you hear me? My name is Renata. Denise has introduced me at the beginning. I'd first like to thank you for the opportunity to be here. This is such a rich moment. I'm very happy to be a member of Praxis, of being a part of this history. Thank you, Denise. Before I say anything else, and I'm going to share the article that I wrote for the construction of this seminar. It's called Ethnography Between Frontiers. This was based on my MSc dissertation. It was called The Possibilities of a Reverse Architecture, based on the reading of urban occupations. I finished it in 2020 under Professor Denise Morado's advisorship. So in this research, I discussed the possibility of reverse architecture So I used anthropological research. So working on Wagner's idea of reverse architecture to create a dialogue with architecture. So thinking about reading the territories. I'm not going to go on and on about reverse architecture as a concept, but from this dialogue, I bring a possibility of reverse architecture as a way to transpose the symbols that are conventionalized and with experimentation that recognizes the other, who lives the territory, who occupies the territory, with his capacity to understand and act in the territory. So to bring these two concepts together, I had to think about the symbols and rethink these symbols and refuse some of the models, such as the model of diagnostic and solution and analyses that are very used in the area of architect, that really affirm the architect as the only detainer of truth, of knowledge in this urban space. And also think about the implication of dominant classes that architecture reproduces, and the symbols and relations of power that maintain this idea of the status of architectures and as architects as having a single domain of the knowledge. So we had as parallel the view that's creative and inventive of those who inhabit and who actually build the city. We wanted to include them and legitimize them. So we wanted to have a less generalist view of the territory. So bringing the concept of really trying to understand these elements that are rooted in architecture. In the development of the research, this is something that came afterwards as a development. It was possible to analyze some frontiers which made clear the understanding of how these relations were manifested in the territory. So the relation between the researched and the researcher. As a development of the research, what I brought to this proposal was that I was able to think about these frontiers, looking for another view through this ethnographic research. I revisited my field work and I wrote another view of the territory, thinking about these frontiers. So I think for my first thing is my first analysis was how it was to be received on the field, on the ground, in my field work. So I met with one of the residents, Marco Aurelio. He was a resident of the Timóteo occupation. I'd been walking for a while and it was very hot. And he invited me in to meet his wife and to get to know his house. So he said, come on right in, make yourself at home. And I was surprised because it was beautiful. So many fruits and plants. It was a huge plantation, a huge garden. We spent hours talking about history. He showed me every bit and corner of his gardens. He was harvesting fruits and vegetables. And we remember that we had first met in 2015 when with my end of course work. We remembered the moment, all the difficulties we shared. And I left Marco Aurelio's houses with some taioba, which is a Brazilian vegetable that they had just harvested from their vegetable garden. And I thought about how this was insignificant, and it was a contrast with that first meeting we'd had in 2015. In 2015, we had made the documentary, and where we this documentary, it's available on YouTube. We talked about the building the establishment of this occupation, of this settlement, and there was no research that involved the university and the architecture school in urban occupations. So as soon as I decided to carry out this research, I researched the phone a contact number, and through a social media page. So the first name there was Marco Aurelius. I introduced myself as an architecture student who wanted to get to know the settlements. He was really scared. He said, architecture. So he thought about City Hall, the government. What are you talking about? Is it government architecture? And he hung up on me. And then afterwards, I got calls from him saying, don't come at us because we're dangerous. He was very scared. He was very frightened. So after that, I was able to get another number. It was Dr. Michele, who was a doctor, a lawyer. And through her, we were able to establish a connection, and we're able to establish a communication with the community. And from then on, we really established this network of relation, a process of experiencing together. From 2015 on, I've been working on a network of support that's continuous. So it was really interesting to understand this initial discomfort, and then to go on to be welcomed in such a warm manner, to leave with a bouquet of vegetables. So it was interesting to see this the progress and change in this relationship between beyond deconstructing this initial discomfort. It was also important to build a feeling of strangeness of what I was doing as an architect in a settlement. So they had this idea of problem solving. So my professors and colleagues, they had this idea that, you know, in working using concepts like revitalization, bettering, these processes, these concepts really illustrate very well these relations of power and how this happens even in academia and in the process of building. So these issues also made me, you know, develop a discomfort and with the area of architecture, and that also led me to want to have a dialogue with anthropology, so I could develop a strangeness towards the familiar. So with this anthropological view, I was able to build a reverse process and thinking about the limitations of our field so that we could build a relation that is a relation between equals, where I can recognize the creative capacity of the other and the process of mediation. From the, how can I analyze the way that someone perceives the world, to understand the world, the other, not just a generic person as any agent, but as a concrete person who has agency, creativity, and very important things that need to be said. A process that's beyond a process of charity. It's a process of conviction in the importance of that which the other has to be said. The location of this practice is in the field, and it's a second frontier. At a second frontier, I think about the relations in the field and off the field. This frontier was very present in our conversations with the dwellers, the settlement dwellers. Most of the times I was walking in the area, I was accompanied by Jaqueline. There are 7 occupations Timóteo in 3 different neighborhoods. So I always heard the frontiers from Jaqueline. She would say, from here to there, it's ours. From there beyond, it belongs to the others. So there were unconscious frontiers. They knew where one occupation started and where it ended. There is a difference between the organized and spontaneous occupations. All throughout these years that I've been a part of and like have a lived experience in these occupations, this was very interesting to me. So I also I also investigated these frontiers for clues to understand the formation of these settlements, the ones that were organized, the ones that were spontaneous. And also I understood that there's a legal issue that also emphasizes this issue. I tried to understand a little more of this process, this legal process, how it goes about, how where it's at in terms of the legal status of these occupations, because the repossession of property, they say it only comes for us. So they said, for example, one of the neighbors has lived there for 20 years. She's never had a repossession of property lawsuit come at her, but she has had more than one. She has suffered more than one. So, and the lawyers themselves also use another particularity, specificity in the Timóteo occupations as a defense of the process, because according to them, it's one of the things that makes the legalization. There isn't a definition that which territories are under which legal process. There isn't a very precise survey. So there's a lot of times where repossession of property lawsuits, that tangles them up also, because people don't know which areas are which. Researching the survey of the legal situation, I only found one survey that was carried out by City Hall together with the military police, where they had a quantitative report, and there were codified technical designs with that. So there was a map of the territory, and then another one with some zooms where there are some registrations of houses. And so I also started to question the relations of power between these drawings that are codified. So I started to add to these reports, and I started to add the discussions of the residents to the ethnographic process. So I also transposed these symbols that are conventional, the technical drawings and the codified. So I brought in watercolors, diagrams, collages, other processes with that is less codified to count as a counterpoint to the coding existent in architecture. And last, another final frontier that establishes the relations between the researcher and those researched. And there were some challenges through the research, and they had a lot to do with participation and involvement, engagement of the residents. And this is something I see people, colleagues in different areas. So I really needed to understand what this data point meant. What did it mean that we were going into the field so often and getting so many no's as answers? So there were issues related to the lack of time, the lack of, there was a lot of urgency, other commitments. It's really important to understand that the residents, mainly women, the leadership is mainly made up of women. So they have a lot of these obligations, and there's a character of urgency that's directly tied to survival. So, being a part of these discussions with the leadership, involvement. So it's, these come in second in terms of, for my survival. She would, one of the people that I talked to, she would say, I have an open window and I'm concerned that the rain is going to fall on my children. I don't have the time to go to a meeting. I'll just go and solve this problem. So this is an issue that's very important. Another issue was the fear and political demobilization. This was during the current president's mandate. And we also had the beginning of the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, and social distancing. So obviously this interfered in several ways. And, as there was also uncertainties in terms of the fear that is related to minorities. Marielle Franco's assassination was always mentioned as an example of how people were fearful. People would say, I don't want to get involved. I don't want to be another Marielle. I heard that a lot. So these statements really affected me a lot. And also there are political interest games, and she has a lot of clarity about how political interests are played out. And, involving not only public policy, but also the political interests of the researchers and students. I need to take a break and have a sip of water here. I'm sorry. I started discussed with Juliana about like feeling that they were constantly being used. And so I think this is a conflict that crosses fields of interests. I'm sorry, everyone. I started to question my presence there because my presence was necessary and justifiable by the city dwellers. Often I was, they would say things like, oh, look at the architect who's going to renovate our little room. So I started to question the limits of my presence. So I finalized with these, my discomfort, and I think our role is to create new discomfort. That's it.
Thank you, Renata. I'd like to thank you and say, in a certain way, I understand this very well. I've felt this emotion that you felt a few times before. We have this challenge of dealing with these processes of dislocation of our place, of our, when we're dislocated, when we say we're going to face of reality, that's not our reality. I've lived this a lot. When I was doing my master's, I was discussing Vila Viva and the Aglomerado da Serra. I participated in the plan of Aglomerado da Serra. Then I came back as a master's student, and it was very hard. And we had this impact of this dislocation of my place and facing criticisms to my work and my life. So I just wanted to tell you that and say that you found a little bit of this, and we have a certain resistance in relation to the state that's completely understandable. But when you talk about the state, well, this is yet another layer of this challenge of this location. So I really understand that, and there were some things that people said that were very harsh for me, and it really hurt for me to listen. And I had to face that in this process when I was doing my master's degree in the community of Aglomerado da Serra. And now I question whether I can bring these criticisms to the public sector in my work. How do we bring these fissures and this dislocation to such a structuring machine as the state? This is the sort of provocation that I'm trying to reach, and taking the opportunity that we're here and talking from my place. Cícero has already worked in the city hall. He had a different path from mine, and I think this is very interesting for us to talk. It's been a long time since we talked, but we did work together at City Hall. And now he's been at the university for a while, and I think I remember that I had just gotten into to the municipal government when when he left, right, Tarcísio? So let's go straight to your presentation, and then we'll open up for debate. Thank you, Belle. I'm the one to thank you. All of our professional experiences become sort of collages in this work that I'm going to present to you now. Just 1 second. So this study is being developed in the environment of a doctoral research PhD that I'll be finishing this year at the end of the year. And I'd like to share with you a few of the discussions that I've already carried out thus far. So my main discussion today that I'm working on is structuring a method for the identification of fissures in public spaces. My research works investigating the actions and reactions of agents in the public space. And then I'm going to show you what I'm considering as agents, trying to understand their potential of change in the denial of alienating situations that are pre-configured, and then the consequent search for actions that are not subjugated by coercive practices that coerce freedom of expression. And this shows this is represented by this kid. He's coming up to this garden in an unconventional way, as you can see. And I'm going to bring in the concept of fissures that is used by John Holloway exactly to name these kinds of other actions. So I'm going to be developing my presentation based on that. We are based on 4 assumptions. The first of them is that, as Bauman says, we're living in an interregnum. Interregnum is a term which has to do with the Roman Empire, which is a period between kings. So when a sovereign died and there was an election of the next one, there was a period when laws were suspended. So it was a hiatus of sorts. So Bauman, during the 2008 crisis, says that we are in an interregnum. The previous situation no longer exists, but it's not very clear what the next situation will be. In this interregnum, we have a very strong process of neoliberalization. Neoliberalism stops behaving as an ideology and becomes a rationality, a process with its own strategies. But on the other hand, we have movements that are opposing this, people who are trying to work on their lives in such a way as to seek ruptures with this process that is swallowing up everyone and everything. And so I analyzed this process of neoliberalization versus those who oppose them as they are inserted in the public space, which is my field of study. So, having explained our 4 assumptions, the question that I work in my research is the following. In this moment of interregnum, the process of neoliberalization has been getting stronger despite the proliferation of movements that oppose capitalism. Understanding that public space as an arena that's common to both sides, the development of conflicts that are present in their use, that is actions and reactions, can contribute to the constitution of fissures that might help the taking back the street as a place of living together inside this conflict. So we've been seeing this polarization nowadays, and people getting away from the streets and joining in virtual discussions in the virtual world. And it's very necessary for us to once again use the street as a place to live together and to have disputes, so that we understand how this game is played as well, this game of actions and reactions. I'm also like to present a sentence from Bauman, which says the promotion of security always requires the sacrifice of freedom, while freedom can only be gained through the expense of security. So we have this permanent tension. And this is exposed in our society through a variety of mechanisms, variety of security mechanisms, in this case, mechanisms that try and protect private property. But what happens is that these mechanisms leave this border on the private to the public. And so they're more and more present in the public spaces themselves, the places where people could just hang out and stay. A quick search in Google Street View in Belo Horizonte, you will see this gradual change. Places where you have public spaces being closed or even any spaces that promote people getting together. Here we have the Freedom Square, Praça da Liberdade. And so now the fountains all have gates around them. This is a public library where the reading space that used to be a sort of patio was closed. And now actually, even this little right in front of it has been closed. So as capitalism continues its impulse, its inexorable impulse to corner every single centimeter of the planet inside its logic of money and markets, even colonizing our thoughts and controlling our desires and behaviors, there are new practices emerging that are redefining politics and opening unpredictable spaces. As much as they have the strength, people want to be in the streets. Here we can see some pictures from the Praia da Estação, which started as a movement against the closing of this plaza to political manifestations, and now it's a carnival celebration. And here we have some kids who use the fountain in the Praça da Liberdade in the square, and we also have new paths that are opened by people, showing the inefficiency of our designs, of the architect's proposals, and even these alternative forms of communication that people use, direct communication, donating avocados that are produced in the plaza square itself. They have this man who produces seedlings for people to take, and there are people who decorate trees. We have little libraries that people put up, and even alternatives for people can donate clothes to people who might need them, and even people who refuse to accept the lack of public furniture or accepting these exclusion mechanisms, and they start opposing them, resisting them creatively. Here, for instance, this man is shaving next to a bank using the glass as mirrors. They are sitting down over there in those little stumps that prevent cars from entering that area. So we have actions and reactions. To understand this conflict a little bit, in my research, I name the different agents. I have personified agents, institutional agents, and non-corporeal agents. The personified agents are those who exercise actions in the public space. So when I talk about the resident, it's a resident of the public space. The worker is a public space worker, protester, etc. Once we have these 12 agents, I also identified the main forces of reaction that this meeting might lead to. I named 5 reaction forces. We have assimilation, which is when the person that's reacting, it reacts assimilating the action of that agent. I have the subjection force as when someone reacts, subjecting themselves to what the agent has proposed. And I call a certain force the domination force when someone reacts by subjugating the action produced by the agent. And so I spatialize this. This diagram brings us the spatialization of these 12 agents, showing with these lines the infinite possibilities of actions and reactions between the various agents amongst themselves. So I might have the media reacting to a given street protest. I can have the state through its bureaucracy reacting to someone who is living in public spaces. We might have media reacting to the environment, and so on and so forth. And so my research is defined through the identification of the main types of actions that I called A1, A2 and A3. The A1 actions are those that succumb to reactions for domination and shock. So for instance, when an agent of the state removes people who are working in a public space, the action of that person that was working in a public space leads to an action of domination by the public power, and that person no longer can work at the public space. I call A2 those actions which generate a more subtle domination that we know as co-opting. So for instance, when the state ends up incorporating, as in the case of Belo Horizonte, the mayor's office incorporates street carnivals, which reemerge through criticisms that came from street protests. And we have A3 actions, which are those that are not seen. They do not succumb, either because the reactions to them were assimilation or subjection. So I mark this with a yellow color because it's going to be important from this point on. And I also identify that out of these actions that completely or partially succumb, we have residual actions that I call A4 and A5, as well as those that don't succumb. We have additive and subtractive actions that are doors to new actions. And we also have AN, which are new actions that are continually emerging. So I have a special interest in these actions that are marked in yellow, that identify in them the possibility of fissures emerging. In this moment, I'm considering a fissure as that action that combines a creative denial. You start practicing the alienated situation, but you propose something else. It's an action that has a certain resilience, has a certain persistence based facing the reactions against them, and it has a large power of connectivity. So these are the actions that I research in my study. And a variety of different authors say that we need to try and multiply these fissures. The more breaches and fissures we can find, the more effect we'll have in the public space. So what I propose to analyze is to seek and try and understand narrative of events that happened in the public spaces of Belo Horizonte starting in 2008, trying to reach three different issues, trying to look at the intentions that motivated them, the reactions provoked by them, and the reach of their actions. The study is being done in three ways: through studying news and sites and blogs, looking at a record that's already done, and I wasn't omnipresent or omni-aware to know all of this. And then there's also the study of legislation to understand the main rules and norms, to understand what's being followed and what's not being followed, and also trying to understand other meanings of events. And I also have interviews with reference people, so to speak, to fill in the gaps of my research. So in my study, when I'm studying narratives and news articles, this happens through the search of certain expressions on Google. These results are transcribed to a Microsoft Excel file. The content of these articles are sent to WordPad, and they are compiled to be analyzed by AntConc, which is a credential software. So this is the kind of a form, this is the specific form that I need to put this into my Excel spreadsheet, and you also need to name the file in a certain way. My initial framework my ground zero is this user who was sunbathing in a plaza in Belo Horizonte, a square. This is, for those of you who are not in Belo Horizonte, this is a very uncommon sight, not only because we're far away from the beach, but a very traditional city. And so this event had reactions, both reactions from the public power arresting her, and it also led to other reactions of support. We had protests and manifestations of support. This action ceased for a while, but we can see that after that, this same square was considered an abandoned square because it was being occupied by homeless residents. And we'll see that the beach at the station event gaining force and gaining strength. So what did I do this? I put this in a timeline. And so this image on the right shows that the more I research an event, it opens up new possibilities. It brings us other events based on these news articles. So now, thus far, I've been studying these 6 events. These events are here on the left. This is a way to show you what the nomenclature of these articles is like, so I can analyze them. And on the right, I show you how I registered them on my Excel spreadsheet. When I registered them on the Excel spreadsheet based on the date and the search order, the order in which the result is delivered to us in Google, I can analyze a few things. The main one is a temporal analysis, because I put into the same table a variety of different events that are correlated to each other. Here in black, we have certain legislation and decrees that are published, or those pieces of legislation that are relevant to these actions. So when I put this on the timeline, I can understand the correlations of one thing with the other. So so far, the analysis of the action of that single user of the House Suarez Plaza when she wore her bathing suit to sunbathe, based on this graph that I show here, brings us this following result. So she took an action, an isolated action. She decided to sunbathe in her swimsuit. And so there was reactions of domination and shock from the public sector, and also certain actions of assimilation and subjection. Some people thought that was cool. Some people wanted to support her. And based on media reactions, there was a residual action, which is this manifestations of support and protests. And so we had an isolated action that had certain types of reactions to it. And this leads to another action. And this new action of support leads to other reactions. So our study tries to investigate whether these later events are correlated to this initial event, the sunbathing incident. So other individual actions, such as the Respect for Belo Horizonte movement, which was when they prohibited the protests at the station plaza. So we can see that it's a game at the end of the day. An action leads to different types of reaction that lead to new actions that lead to new reactions. At the same time, the study has compiled the main laws and norms that incide on the public spaces. Here I share what the crime is and what are the different kinds of prison or fine. What is the actual sentence that people can have? And so there are certain actions that are not, whether they actually infringe the law or not. So according to the legislation, you sunbathing in a plaza is not a crime according to the Brazilian legislation. Some people don't know about this, and they end up not acting this way. So when we understand and we look at this law in a gradation from the result to the actual infringement, we can see that we have very harsh sentences and we have some very light sentences. And so up to this moment, these are the considerations I have thus far, answering those 3 questions that I shared to identify whether an event can be classified as a fissure or not. What we see is that in terms of denial, these and creation, these actions that were researched were motivated by a certain feeling of trying to do things differently, and with notions of what people understand as being a right to public space that is free and open, full of new possibilities. These events that were researched, also in different degrees of intensity, have different degrees of resilience, and resilience has been a crucial element in order to understand the effects of a given action. So I present here 2 graphs that analyze my search results for my search related to the woman sunbathing and the beach at the station protest. So you can see that in relation to the woman sunbathing, after we dropped really quickly after the 8th search results, whereas we have more than 30 pages of results based on a search based on the beach at the station protest. And so it's a bigger motivate, since it's a larger, has a bigger influence, it leads to more events. So this first event has already ended in a certain way, but it is still affecting further newer events. This is the idea of connectivity. The events which are cataloged, they reveal themselves as those that gather new actions in a clear allusion to the metaphor of passing on that burden to the next. And so finally, we have 2 challenges after 2020 that I'm not going to call the post-COVID era, because we don't know whether we'll have a post-COVID era or not. So what happened starting in 2020 is that we were dealing with xenophobia and apophobia in our spaces, and aversion to everything that is strange and other, and also those are poor. And this is now being replaced by other phobias, including hypochondria, hygiene obsession, trans-stored isolation. And so this is a force that goes against the idea of the propagation of fissures. And maybe a very important force was the consolidation of the virtual world, our video practices like what we're doing right now. And each time the world gets more and more virtual, the more it is subject to these chaos engineers, the propagators of fake news, for instance. So this is the scenario that the study has outlined thus far. These are my references. And here's my contact in case you have any questions or want to contribute. I'm also available for that. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of you, Lydia, Pedro, Renata, Tarcísio, for your different points of view on the city, which is our main provocation today. And based on our point of view, which is based on the public sector, which, like it or not, it has a different way of looking at it. Even though it's Gisella and Izabel, we are occupying a different place to those, to the other people who are here in this discussion, in this debate, in this exchange, in the seminar. But I'd really like to deeply thank something that Renata said, which has to do with getting bothered. The sense of this seminar is to really reinforce the sense of disquieting amongst itself. And when we think of the public power as this large transatlantic vessel, this huge cargo vessel that's hard to steer, and when you have to actually steer, you this leads to a series of different demands and procedures and time before this transatlantic can steer and head to another direction different to what it's been going in. All of the presentations today bring this sort of this unsettlement to us who occupy public sector jobs. And so it's more and more important for academia and social movements and the civil society, even if it's an action that comes from someone who's occupying a city in a different way without any big institution, be it a resident or someone who's walking the streets that's provoking a communication in relation to something. And so it's important for us to promote a way to look and hear the city in a more fair way, with the possibility of people having the right to speak, all the different stakeholders and participants. So each time we have this unsettlement that can provoke us and rattle us a little bit, I think the stronger will be to actually steer the huge transatlantic cargo vessel, but without losing the actual awareness that you are steering a transatlantic ship. This is the huge awareness that we need to do a good job when working in the public sector in the state. But I think it was great to listen to all your great participations. I agree with Bell that when Lydia is talking about the representation with such a lightness, even in her form of showing exchanges between Chicago and Belo Horizonte, this is super interesting as well. I have a few questions for each of you. So we're sharing the same space. We are work colleagues. So you can see the both of us are here. We are work colleagues. We work together. We are here in the mayor's office, City Hall. We have a lot of different thoughts that we share amongst ourselves. We also have distinct points of view because we have different histories. So I think that's important for us to deal with, which is something that Renata also mentioned. We'll never be like others because of what other people have lived. We can try and reach something a little bit closer. Well, I wanted to have a few questions for Lydia. Right when you started, Lydia, you had a provocation based on the segregation that takes place through non-investment and defunding. And you see that it's a social and racial segregation. You show how investments in white areas, and then we have brown areas and black areas. You have foreigners as well, those who are not from that territory. And so when you talk about segregation based on investment and funding, are they public investments? Are they investments that come through the real estate market and are reinforced by the public sector? Because I wanted to have a few provocations for each of you in the sense of, as the public power, what can we do to respond a little bit to these alarms, these unsettlements that really were brought about by your presentation? So up to what point is this a market action? Is it a market action that reinforced by the public sector? And in which way can the public power be a sort of opposing agent? In which way can the state, maybe through its legislation or through some type of other investment, favor this rupture, favor these ruptures of de-investment, defunding in the territory? I thought it was very interesting to have this practice of valuing emptiness before occupation. I thought that was beautiful, and I thought it was beautiful that it starts from the residents themselves. It's not the recognition of something that's been abandoned. It's something that makes sense after they occupy that place, be it for housing or from sort of equipment that's going to help out the community. So I think this is the way in which we can lend greater sense to something. And this is something like, it's the rest of something that I found, and I'm using it, I'm occupying. I think that's really cool. There was a point that made me a little bit well, is it a way of looking at the central area of Belo Horizonte? I know that's where the city started, and that's connection to Chicago was based on that, on this desire to have a Brazilian Chicago. So the process of occupying this first urban nucleus repeats racial segregation of those who built the city but didn't occupy the city from the very first moment. And based on that, I have a provocation for me. This is not from the public power. This is from me specifically. I want to tell you, Lydia, go beyond this the Beltway and go and see where are the people who actually built the city and who were here at first and where they are now and the history they have to share. I say this especially because of the Black movements. So I think this is just a short provocation. I think it would be great for you to go beyond this universe of the new market and of these spaces, which I think are very interesting, but which have other locations in the city that are occupied by this original population, the population that was here before we wanted to build the Brazilian Chicago. And so we can see how they live in this city, which is bigger than just what's inside the Beltway. In Pedro's presentation, you know what I want, Pedro? You say that the real estate market incorporates a certain logic from Airbnb in order to strengthen a desire of production, which in a certain sense is very interesting since it goes beyond property and it brings the possibility of use beyond property. But up to what point couldn't we go beyond this model of making cities that, to me, at least through Airbnb, seem to be for a very specific slice of social and economic profiles, but to actually create spaces to occupy cities, not only based on property, but for other social strata. Shouldn't the public power try and exercise some sort of role showing this market that there are other slices of the market that can be reached, and not this kind of point of view from inside this speech in relation to construction, deconstruction, bridges? I thought it was extremely beautiful. Got very emotional about your presentation, and including what that resident said when you said you're an architect. Who is this architect? What is she here to do in this place? What is she going to answer? She's going to give me a practical expectation of actually living the space, of improving housing, improving infrastructure. What is she doing here? Is she just researching me as an object for an academic text? And I think you went way beyond that. I thought it was super important to live this sort of experience beyond just the academic process in the territory. These are people that go beyond just being an object of research. And as a public power, we often occupy this place of having a very clear diagnosis, and we try and identify it very clearly. And so dislocating yourself from this numerical diagnosis of a type of action that's so crystallized in certain practices for another shape, even deconstructing the point of view of that community in relation to the public power, because the public power is very diverse within itself. And as much as we might have this huge transatlantic ship, those who are steering this transatlantic have a whole structure that makes this ship function might be very different one from another. So trying and bring people together, those who are in the transatlantic, together with the people who are living in the city, who are studying in the city, who are prioritizing the city, who are trying to look at these different practices of living, these practices that are localized in different areas, and that we often call the non-city. And so sometimes we can look at the way of occupying spaces as being incorrect or wrong and having this difficulty and checking out whether this action can really benefit what's going on there. It's very challenging to actually mediate this, having a shared mediation. We don't know how to actually do this. I just wanted to bring you a little bit of my perceptions. I thought having this exercise from Cícero is very interesting, bringing a specific fissure and correlating this to legislation and its repercussions. I thought that this was very interesting, and I thought this is wonderful. It's great that we have you to identify this fissure and the knowledge and the different forms. I had a recent opportunity of doing a mediation course at Lincoln, in which, well, the provocation that was sent to us at all time was being able to recognize actions in time, the effects of these actions in time, and how we could potentialize or not potentialize so that this wouldn't interfere in the decision-making potential of those different universes that were there. This entered my head many different moments. And so I think that we don't just look at the city, we're just trying to do this exercise of mediation in a variety of different places, and oftentimes with tools that are way below what we would need as the conditions to actually minimize this sort of difference in power that so when you give us this action of a woman being sunbathing in the square, and some people want to arrest her, so we have a lack of proportionality in the reaction of the state that's very harsh in relation to something that should be very natural, which is using the city, occupying public spaces. So it's very interesting to see how this happens. And then we have other examples in which you have a condition of a result. I don't know if this is a good name, but as an effect, which is living this event of the Praia da Estação protests. But what if we hadn't had that specific moment where a woman just was sunbathing? Would we have that? Well, I'm here. I've just been talking on and on. I've made some loose questions to some people. I hope Bell is a little bit more objective than me. And so what I would really like to do is to thank all of you, to thank you for this possibility of being unsettled, and that based on that, so that we can build new things and so that we can look at the city in other places. And I think my biggest question for all of you is, how do we, in the place that we occupy in the public sector, as this big, huge ship that's navigating the seas, how can we respond to the provocations that you have brought with your presentations? I'm going to let Izabel speak because I'm going to, I think I've spoken too much.
Okay. Well, first off, I'm just, I'm going to have a chat because I think this is where we're at. Objectivity isn't my forte. I'm a good opener, not a good closer of discussions, but I'm going to discuss starting off from G's intervention, trying to think about what is my effort, what is my personal effort, also as not just personally, but as a group, the urban planning group, that I think it's a team that's tried to deal with these challenges, bringing this reality of the practices that exist in urban spaces, bringing them into public policies. These ruptures with political and with institutionalized politics, and how this affects me, and how I've been trailing and elaborating. Although I recognize and feel really anguished because I feel we're very distant from being able to do something that's actually different, to actually incorporate a listening practice of these communities. Because going back to the transatlantic metaphor, you know, the state isn't me and G, it's society represented in its inequalities. You are also state as a public university with another occupying a different location of the state. Today, I coordinate a process that is planning of the Isidoro settlements. It's been very difficult, sometimes hurtful because of these limits and difficulties. When we are faced, you know, with the issues, often we feel that we're not able to practice what we preach, and there are institutional barriers. So you inspire us, but also I'd like to develop to challenge you also to walk a mile in our steps. I understand that Denise and the group has these challenges, faces these challenges. So when I was listening to you today in the seminar, and you know, over the years that I followed the Praxis group, I've thought about planning and government. Our trail of being in the planning process versus the government itself. Historically, in government offices, we have static planning processes that really don't encompass the processes and the challenges, the challenge to deal with the process and not with just a historical point in time. So my emphasis on government and public office and university, because we're part of this process. We can't be ingenuous in terms of our power relations. We can't obfuscate our location. But if we understand this as a huge structure, that we are a part of a machine that is in movement, how do we enter this process? How do we interfere or not with this process? In the Isidoro settlement, for example, we've discussed an action plan that has short, medium, and long term, rather than just go right into the long-term planning. So we try to incorporate the practices of the communities. Have we been completely successful? No. There are political interferences, the political interferences in the territory. There are this political interferences between land grabbers and drug trafficking. And there's a lot that is challenging, and we have a layer that is technical. This provocation that Renata makes us in terms of the diagnosis, every work I've coordinated, I've said, I don't want a diagnosis. You already know your intention. Your view is propositional, but you're not transparent about it. You pretend there's no intention. We're not able to. We are still, going about 300 pages of diagnosis, of proposals, and 10 pages were, we have all of these pages filled with expectations that existed there before. So I let you know that, my strong point wasn't objectivity, but I wanted to bring this possibility of the approximation of these practices for us to think about them in a strengthening of process and less project and planning, in this idea of being transversed and affected by time and space. I'd like to ask this reflection that you bring, how could this come, how could your provocations be applied to the state? For example, fluidity, permanent negotiation, and that's what I call management, government management, that is not static in a plan. How could the government contribute to the open city? Sometimes we think it's impossible, but sometimes we think we need to leave the state, that it could only be done through struggle and rupture. But on the other hand, it's through the state is that we are able to construct public policies. But so we're always on this tightrope, as it were. For Lydia, it's so hard to have a planning by fluidity. I think you're correct, because you can't remove yourself from your place, from, a place where you feel like you belong. But maybe a challenge might be visiting, the places where you're dislocated from your space, and thinking about how to enter areas where you're dislocated. For Pedro, I always, as I was listening to you and when I read you, how the logic of Airbnb, the idea of sharing, but however it's used as an economic practice by Airbnb, but the opportunities of this idea for public policy, of the discussion of house sharing, and use of abandoned buildings, how could they go back to being used, not through the market, but through housing? I wanted to provoke you in those terms. If you had any, if you could shed some light on how the sharing logic could be used for the good, for housing. I think there's an interesting reference. The FICA movement in São Paulo, they are planning social rent with, and thinking about the mobility of demands of popular members of the lower income class. So they're discussing the logic of the cortiço, and they are offering low rent possibilities. So maybe the sharing logic could shed some light on public policies of real estate. Renata, you met the challenge of the limit of the architect and also the limit of the state. They hated you more when they thought you were City Hall, more than when they thought you were just an architect. Sometimes I feel like this is impossible to deconstruct. So I wanted to share my anguish because when I worked in Aglomerado da Serra as a researcher, I had this anguish, but at the end of the day, I was accepted. But as City Hall, it's so much more difficult. It's not me as City Hall. There have been so many different interventions and historically of the city government. Sometimes I'm angry at the university, being really candid here. You have to help us build this, because doing things as public policy, as the government, we don't go in and we don't have the freedoms you do. We have possibilities of action and transformation because we have the resources, but we have another insertion, another political insertion in these territories. So for example, in the case of Isidoro, that we could talk about so many, but especially in the midst of the pandemic, it was super challenging. But we were trying to have a participatory process, and they wanted to know, like, we're not going to tell you what we want if we don't know what you're about. So really, of course, there was a history of repression, but it just feels like it's impossible to have a different process. And often the university has this position. So sometimes there's like some conflict between how you present yourself and how far you can go. I don't have answers for any of that. I'm putting forth here. I'm just sharing reflections. I'd like you to bring some reflections of what you went through. And if you had, if you could shed some light, how could we build connections? What we've What we've done in Isidora settlement is the idea of popular counselors who mediate between the settlement dwellers and the public power. But a lot of the times, you know, the university is often researchers from the university think they are part of the community. We have to understand we are not them. We will never be. We should not be. So this limit, how do you perceive the limit of the action of universities in these territories, and how this entrance of the universities could help the action of the executive power as you know, making knowledge as part of practice, how the university could help us in this construction. It's impossible to fully answer this question, but you know, we could just give it an initial kickoff. The same thing with Tarcísio. Tarcísio, your research is amazing. It looks a lot like a continuation of when you were in City Hall, when you were discussing projects, and there was an effort in terms of building less definitive and formatted public spaces, but we know that the result isn't that. There are some fissures, but if we look at the projects of the Savassi Square, the Hipercentro, there is a limit to these expansions. So I'm curious to know how you perceive this. What is the role of these fissures in the establishment of debate? Is it possible to consider these fissures in the construction of public spaces, or will they always be in ruptures with will public policies always be later challenged and receive fissures? Is it arrogant to consider that we can build a fissured space? Of course, we can build spaces that are more open to fissures, but how far do they feed into the projects proposed by the government? I think that's it from me. I know it's so open and confusing. We did this freestyle. What we wanted is to search an approximation through the difference. I mean, we're occupying different positions. We're partners, but with different positions, but we could maybe think together from these reflections. I don't know if Denise, you invited us for this. Oh, I think it's great. So I'm here to provoke you. I love it. I think it's great. I can't hear you. Maybe it's me. I can hear you. Let me take this off. I would like to say I'm like really looking forward to taking. Yeah, I'd like to make some closing remarks. I'm loving this. We invited you because you occupy another space that's not ours. And we can't, just talk to peers. If it's hard enough, if we don't talk to other sectors, things are just impossible. I'm going to let Lydia, Pedro, Renato, and Tarcísio. And if there's time, we still have a few questions, or if we don't have time, I'll make some closing remarks. But let's go, Lydia. Good afternoon again. I think several questions were this is my first time with this kind of lecture, so one thing that I found really interesting it's hard for me to study Mercado Novo because Mercado Novo has an image of gentrification. It's in the hypercenter, hipercentro, where there's a lot of a history of investment, but that's what I want to study. I really want to study how the folks in the first floor relate to what is happening above. And that is our central question in Chicago, gentrification. Gentrification, and when there is interpretation apologizes, but the connection is really difficult to hear. Your connection, internet connection doesn't seem to be good. You know what? Let's try Pedro. Try to disconnect and get back on. Maybe it might get better, and then we'll get back to you, okay? Okay, Pedro. Addressing Gisella's questions. About going past the market niche. So what we are able to notice, real estate connected to Airbnb, the real estate production in the city has been directed at visitors, not to residents. Real estate is being developed for those who are renting or subletting. We see a lot of change in some neighborhoods of the use. For example, in Paris, there's a neighborhood in which the Airbnb population is higher than the local resident population. That's not just the case of Paris. We have Salvador, Batuba, and other cities in Brazil have had problems with Airbnb in that sense. That is the issue. How much does this model extrapolate from tourism and impact the whole city? That's how I'm thinking about it. Because at the end of the day, the other provocation was, how can the public powers, there are regulations, because a lot of the rules and regulations Airbnb have been barring regulations. So first, we have to understand what is different in platforms in relation to other touristic apartments, and also think about incentives in approving new constructions. Sometimes there's a transference in the right to share. This can be a possibility for these huge building projects that are are directed at a high power of acquisition for Airbnb. For Izabel, which is very connected to the discussion, is how would the sharing idea go towards the public good? So we think, in, for example, in a platform urbanism, has an imposes a on public policy. So Belo Horizonte doesn't organize its space for Airbnb to act in. So, but Airbnb demands characteristics from Belo Horizonte, for example. So how can we twist this upside down? How can we turn it around? How can the public power really counter these impositions from the market? Trevor Scholes, for example, a researcher, talks about platform co-ops. There's a lot of really interesting initiatives. They are co-ops. They have fair work practices. They discuss racism issues, equity. So they think about collective forms of uses of these platforms in cities. So these are 2 points that I was moved by your provocations. So first, to try to be aware of domination of cities by tourism, and also how to turn the key to turn the power relations on the relations between government and Airbnb. I'm going to try to be a little more objective. It's not my strong point. About the view from the inside, the up and close view, it's really important to have dialogues with other fields. Like going into anthropology opened a lot of doors for me, a lot of knowledge. And it comes from a provocation from Denise, from Praxis, an incentive to talk to other fields, to other people like we're doing here. I think this is very rich. I think it contributes a lot. That's it. About the question, how the public power can answer, I think, this has a lot to do with Izabel's conversation on ruptures and practices. This is a $1 million question. I don't know how to answer it. It's a little of what Izabel said. It's a process and it's an experimentation because there's not a model. There's not different territories, different city halls. I don't know if it's too hopeful I see this moment as a fissure. I don't know if it's necessarily the beginning of a fissure, but the continuation of a fissure in this sharing process. Also, as we were talking about, there are different city halls. I had an experience with the Chimacho City Hall, and it was the opposite of what you said. The people there, they have funds to be used by the settlements, and the City Hall does not want to hear the dwellers. Their response was, no, the technicians are already carrying things out. They didn't they're already carrying a diagnosis. They had no effort into even trying to establish a conversation, thinking about the technical design models, the diagnosis models. It's another reality. It's another city hall. And it's maybe that's why when they associated architecture to the government, maybe that's why they were so scared, because it's this relationship with the government that's built there. It's another reality. It's a smaller city than Belo Horizonte, and the power relations are different, and they involve, it's an industrial city. There is so I bring this in my text, and also how the university can help the relationship between the government and the communities. And this, I bring in my presentation a lot of uncertainty of this moment that we're going through, of uncertainties in research and teaching with this government, and the outreach projects, the university outreach projects. What is it going to be like? I am very disquieted. I have more questions even, and more, I'm more unsettlement. We have a permanent search, moved by unsettlement. I don't know if there's a correct and objective answer for this. That's it from me. I think it's me. First, I'd like to thank Gisella and Izabel for their considerations. I really like the question, how can public policies and the government answer your questions? When Izabel says the city is a process and the state is like a machine in movement. I spent 5 years in City Hall. It was a unique experience. It was really interesting to be on that side, take that perspective, making projects feasible. As you know, there are different city halls. We have different states, really. So we have that state, which is the twin of the market. They are symbiotic, the market and the government, they're twins. And there's also the state who's the rebel sibling, the one that does not follow the orders, does not follow that team. And I know the sector that I worked in, that you're still in, thankfully, is the rebel sibling, because I understand that many of these fissures have to come from within the state, from these sectors themselves. And I'm really happy to see the advancements that you have been able to establish in terms of the new directing plan. And there was a lot of opposition, and still is, but in this plan, urban plan design, I see a lot of possible features. For example, some specific areas that you've proposed, but I understand that there has to be more internal fissures inside City Hall. Before I go into that, maybe my talk was a little confusing, but the swimsuit lady, she was not taken in by the police for indecent exposure, but for disrespect to the police. So it wasn't indecent exposure. So this was one of the issues that the police alleged. But for example, police, you know, is discretionary in their interpretation. And, you know, often this makes things difficult. So Marcia could not lie down on the grass. Why can people play ball? He said, no, you can't. You have to be on the stone path, because the grass here is a garden. I was during that period, I was in City Hall. We were really excited when we, you know, when we heard there was a woman in a swimsuit in the square. I understand that different fissures might have been opened from, you know, within, you know, and if we said, hey, this is awesome, use the square is yours. But, you know, there was a lot of people were weirded out. There was more discomfort than approval. I think we should consider fissures. We have to be very aware of these fissures, of what people already do in the day-to-day in these spaces. But of course, we can't have the government being like the promoter of fissures, because of course the government that is twins with the market is interested in co-opting for the forces of the market. So it's really important that there are other openings, other fissures, but it's really important, of course, to be attentive to that which is done in the city and stimulate that people use the space in unpredictable ways that they already do. So this is my, you know, also my answer to what Gisella had questioned. And also another thing that Gisella, you know, mentioned, and maybe wasn't clear, one of the hypotheses that I worked with, that yes, the Praia da Estação Beach is a reverberation of this isolated incident. It doesn't mean that swimsuit lady was the cause, but it did influence what came to be the beach later. So this is still being incorporated into the research, but we understand the role of this wave, as it were, that according to the correct conditions, the possibility of a fissure, it starts to reverberate. And yeah, in a nutshell, that's it that I wanted to add. Lydia, would you like to see if it's working now? Is this better? First, I want to thank you for the criticism. It helps to understand your context. And I will also learn a lot with a lot of criticism. I'd like to answer the question about the state. I don't understand the state here. I understand the states of Illinois and Chicago, but I think something that can help my work there, in our relationship with the state and all of those who work at City Hall, we all have a master's. We know how to build a better city. We're equals. I think the hard part is that the encryption. Those who have the power in the state use it. Do not have are not transparent in their expectations, and tools that can make a city more equitable. So I think if we had clearer communication about the expectations of policies, I know this is very high level, but this was my idea. The second, I think Tiago had a question in the chat. Why did I Mercado Novo? It's in the center, in the city center. It would be more interesting for him for me to leave the Beltway. Maybe it's great in a few months, but what I want to, I want to see the place of conflict. I want to see the conflict between the ground floor and the third floor. It's real life. It's happening all over in every city. What was here before and what is happening now, I don't know. I'm going to start off with this and then we'll see. That's it from me. Thank you, Lydia. We'll have to wrap up because we have our interpreters. We have a certain time. There are some questions that were made for Lydia. I'm going to send them to you by email and then you can answer them. We're kind of running out of time, but they were covered by Gisella and Izabel in a sense. I'm also going to use my power my little power to comment on the common theme in the 4 talks. And our anguish that has always existed will continue to exist. It is part of our existence. It's this anguish that moves us. It's not unnecessary, but I think Belle and Gisella, we left. We had a dictatorial government and we had a participatory government, and we need to change, and we need to do something that not everybody is open to doing, and it is giving up our tools and giving up our certainties. So this continued negotiation management that you have mentioned. So I've used a concept from psychoanalysis, which is transformative listening. It's not about having city residents going into a hall and just listening to the university or listening to the government, but we have to think about the place of confrontation, democratic confrontation, where we allow ourselves to speak and to listen and speak with listening and speaking without transformation is worthless. And of course, for this transformation to take place, we need to be willing. Like Tarcísio said, there is a power structure and game that often will not allow us to be, makes us not willing to be in a transformative listening stance. But there's no model. But if we want to build a new logic, that's what we're searching for. That's what we're seeking. The first thing would be to create instances of democratic discussion, not where you have spaces where you have bigger representation of the market, the residents, the university, the government, but you have to establish a space of actual transformative confrontation and democratic confrontation. It's a negotiation, it's continued. Okay, do we have another name? Do we have to change the name? Yes, we have to say something different, because if we say the same thing, if we use the same name and the same tools and the same certainties, we are just all about discourse. We say we're about what we want to do. We talk about what we want to do, but people don't know if we'll be able to. Either we change strategies faced with what we have, or we'll continue to be in the same place. It's a gigantic effort. It's formidable, not just by the state. Yes, I feel a lot of solidarity with all the government technicians. But it's a battle also within the university. How often, how many times was criticized by people telling me I wasn't an architect. It wasn't once, it wasn't just twice. So this dispute, it works in different areas. Also, we mentioned the social movements. There are disputes between government leaderships, community leaderships, also technical counseling that, you know, was mercantilized, should be a public project. But so we have to leave just being about good intentions, but use new strategies where we are able to build another logic. The place, the location is of confrontation, democratic confrontation. And that's the question is, who is willing to engage in that? Because there has to be we're not talking just about political will. It's an opening towards an individual and collective transformation. That's the huge issue. We know about things, you know, some of us, the residents, the university, the state, we know what could be done, but how? The how depends on those who are actually interested. Who is to benefit from another logic? Who is interested in another logic? That is the question that we need to address. I couldn't not make this comment. I hope it helps, or maybe bothered a bit, but I think this is our place, you know? Discussing with the government, we need to. We have to make this effort. And understand that, you know, I'll think again. Tonight, I'm going to start thinking about what you said that will transform me, but people have to be willing to listen in a transformative way. And we've been listening to, we've been going through a period in which this listening has been very reduced. We need to broaden the democratic confrontation, and we need to have we need to be hopeful for the next elections. Let's see what's going to take place. So can you open your cameras, Bel and Gisella? Can you final closing remarks, Thiago and Marina? You're listening to me. I will send you the answers through email. I just like to thank you. You always move me a lot. The willingness to listen by institutions is difficult because individually, you know, how do we create this collective consciousness? How can this be a collective project? But, you know, and more than collective, institutional, because this is, you know, it's really difficult. It's so difficult. And how you end up, you know, with your practice contradicting your, you know, it's more than intentions are needed, but it's so difficult when you're linked to an institution, how sometimes you want to implode things and, you know, but, you know, we can't ignore the role and the importance, because as much it's challenging to be in the government, but the government well occupied, it makes a lot of difference. And insisting on being in this place and impregnate this place, that this place, if we negate the importance of the state, if we deny the importance of the state as an agent of power, is a huge mistake. There's no doubt about that. You know, I believe a lot in the micro. If you need to comment, you know, we're 7 people here and a lot of people listening. The fact that we are exposing our ideas, there is a micro movement, from micro to micro movement. Even if we're living times that are difficult, we've advanced in a lot of time, in a lot of things since our democratic reopening. Maybe I'm not as hopeful. Maybe I'm not as hopeful as my last words sounded like, you know, because if we deny things and give up, we have to close our doors. We have to listen. The government, let's bring Bell and Gisella. We have to listen to the movements. We brought Jobert last week. We have to hear our colleagues from the university. We have to listen to each other. We're talking to a seminar. We're talking about a seminar, but you know, it's the same process for a bigger area. It's really hard. The channels of transformative. We talked about an image that we discussed, the water permeating a huge wall, which is the concept of fissures itself. It continues a logic, a certain logic, but there are fissures that arise from denials that do not transform capitalism, but give you different forms of being in this mode of production. Really quickly, just so we can share our anguish. We're going through political times that are very challenging, the pandemic. I just want to, you know, share about my soul. You know, we've been felt abandoned. You know, the university as an institution, if we can say that, there is a critique that's not constructive, a critique that is more stone than water. It doesn't, this stone hits the institution and this institution reacts. The way the critique is directed at the institution, there's a distancing from discussion. I think the first listening process that needs to take place is between these institutions. Of course, the institution has of course, the university needs to be a place of critique, but let's not destroy possibilities of the institution. Well, this is what I'm talking about, democratic confrontation. We haven't been able to do this amongst ourselves, let alone with the movements. It's the new place because of these last years, because of what we're going through in politics has really led to the exhaustion of democratic confrontations. We have to think about this a lot, including, thinking about changes for the next election. I don't think anything is solved yet. If you want to comment something, Tarcísio, Renata, Lydia, Pedro. If not, I want to thank all of you as our invited members. It was a very rich afternoon in terms of thinking. Next Monday, we'll be here again. We still have 3 editions of our seminar. And thank you for your generosity, Belle and Gisella, your patience for discussing with us, for having conversations. We from Praxis will always be open to dialogues with you. I would like for Flavio to close off the session. Thank you to everyone who is following us on YouTube.